Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Clock Tower, Dead Space, Alone in the Dark. It's hard to imagine that once, many fog-shrouded moons ago, that Alone in the Dark was at the very forefront of survival horror. Often referred to as the granddaddy of the genre, and rightly so, the spooky fingerprints of Alone in the Dark could be seen all over the genre for years after release, and still can be today. But there's one game in the series that nobody seems to want anything to do with. And it's not because it sounds like the minions might turn up in it at some point, which honestly might have been better. Originally released in 1992, Alone in the Dark was one of the first games to use cinematic camera angles and featured revolutionary 3D graphics, even if they look like they've been made from an amnesiac's memory of Lego by today's standards. Directed by Frederic Reynal, Alone in the Dark was originally developed by the bizarrely named French developer Infogrames. Infogrames? What is a grame? A game made of grapes? Anyway, the game would spawn 2 sequels through the 90s, but would struggle to keep up with the emerging survival horror genre, with the likes of Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and many others, including Blue Stinger, Hive, Arise, taking what Alone in the Dark had achieved and running with it. At risk of getting left alone in a crowded market, Alone in the Dark would return in the new millennium, but with seemingly little direction. The 2001 reboot saw Alone in the Dark protagonist Edward Carnby given a grungy 2000s makeover, with old Ed now looking more Creed and less like his wife had just died from polio. Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, which interestingly has the same name as a pretty underrated Elm Street movie, continued with the cinematic camera angle style it had popularised years earlier, but used a darker style with pre-rendered backdrops, this time taking a note from the Resident Evil series. Those Infogramers rebranded themselves as Atari in 2003 and got to work on a new game in the series. This addition to the series would be yet another reboot, simply called Alone in the Dark. This rather weirdly ambitious game took a large step away from the original games in the series, featuring a sandbox to explore action set pieces and an episodic style. It also had a lot of money thrown at it, but was panned by critics, and Atari threatened to sue the websites who gave those bad reviews. Imagine if WB Games sued everyone who gave Kill the Justice League a bad review. The economy would be an absolute shambles. It was a whole thing with Atari. Let's just sum it up as classic Atari chaos. If you want to see us do a timeline of just general Atari nonsense, let us know down below. March sees the much anticipated 4th reboot in over 20 years when Alone in the Dark returns to consoles and PC. But 4th reboot, I hear you say? Well, there is an Alone in the Dark game that even mega fans may have missed, 2015's Alone in the Dark: Illumination. A game so poor it pretty much killed the franchise almost entirely to death. But how did it come to this? Well, you'll never guess, but it all comes back to Atari. Time has not been kind to poor old Atari. They were at least partially responsible for crashing the entire video game industry during the 1980s and wound up sparking an urban legend of sorts when they buried unsold copies of E.T. in a landfill. In the 90s, they attempted a hardware comeback with the Atari Jaguar, which bombed big time. By the mid-2000s, they were seriously struggling financially. The 2008 reboot of Alone in the Dark was a major make-or-break game for the company as a whole, but as you are already aware, it totally broke. In 2013, Atari filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Several companies would buy up various Atari-owned IPs such as Desperados 3 is an absolute banger, go play that, Outcast and Battlezone. In unexpectedly surprising news, Atari would emerge from bankruptcy and announce it was getting into the social casino business. Ugh. By the mid-2010s, Atari must have realised they had a few IPs that held some value and that they could potentially make some money off them. They put 3 main games into development: Roller Coaster Tycoon 4 Mobile, Roller Coaster Tycoon World, and Alone in the Dark: Illumination. Alone in the Dark and Roller Coaster Tycoon were both headliners in their respective genres, so as you could imagine, Atari wanted only the very, very best for both. No, sorry, that's... No, sorry, they did. They just did whatever they had behind a fridge. Atari actually farmed out these games to totally unknown companies who we're not sure are actually real people. Roller Coaster 4 Mobile and World were farmed out to On5 and Area 52 Games respectively. Alone in the Dark Illumination, meanwhile, would be handled by Pure FPS. If you are not aware of who Pure FPS are, then welcome to the club, because no one seems to know who these guys are, or were rather. Pure FPS have no other games to their name aside from Illumination. According to the Atari website, they were once working on 2 games called Never and Never Arena. Those obviously never came out. Never mind, eh? Never mind. Yes, you'd be forgiven for not having previously heard of the generic sounding Pure FPS. There's simply no way to tell the size of the company, who worked there, and what they actually worked on. As you can maybe imagine, assigning a totally unknown developer to a major project didn't go down well. Alone in the Dark Illumination would be silently farted out on June 11th, 2015, and it didn't actually receive bad reviews from major publications. This was mainly due to major publications completely ignoring Illumination, but anyone who actually reviewed the game gave it an absolute trashing. The Metro called Illumination hatefully frustrating and patently unfinished. Eurogamer Poland said it was a terrible example of preying on a recognised brand. Most notably, YouTuber and video game critic James Stephanie Sterling had the following to say: "The kind of game that has systematically eroded the game industry over the last few years, cashing in the trust and goodwill of the audience for a quick and very dirty buck." But what was so bad about it? Illumination drew inspiration from 4-player co-op shooters,
which was the style at the time,
and provided a very by-the-numbers experience. Each level would feature an element of procedural generation, as enemies, items and layouts could change per playthrough. Ooh. You'll also have to fight off a variety of bland enemies, which the game throws your way in as an excuse for gameplay. And that's just one issue with Alone in the Dark Illumination, its lackluster ass gameplay. It doesn't do anything at all to excel itself, there's no flair, there's absolutely nothing to write home about. Honestly, it feels a little bit like they just cut it out of a template. Alone in the Dark Illumination sees Ted Carnby, a relative of Edward Carnby from the 2008 release. What is this? Ed, Ted and Neddy venture to the old town of Lorwich, where a mysterious billionaire CEO has reopened the town's mine and now monsters roam the streets, kinda like when Elon Musk unbanned everyone on Twitter. In full Left 4 Dead style, you choose from 4 characters, either Ted, Celeste, Gabriella or Father Henry, each with different abilities such as magic or explosives. Wow. The bland enemies you'll be taking on are standard horror fare, including the likes of wraiths, demons, ghouls and goblins. None of those are anywhere near as iconic as the Left 4 Dead enemies. I mean, who could forget the exploding shape? I mean, let's be real, an exploding vape is far, far scarier. So far then, so survival horror pastiche. But what doesn't help is that there's no cutscenes or even a voiceover to explain what is going on. Just a text plot dump at the start of each level. It doesn't even have an ending, just black writing on a plain white background, promising the saga continues, which seems like a pretty big threat. And that's just really the whole problem with Illumination. The shoestring budget is evident in every single aspect of the production. Poor character and enemy design, drab environments, derivative gameplay, and one of the most dull by-the-numbers multiplayer horror experiences you're ever likely to see. Not only was the game bland and forgettable, but completely terrible art design and muddy textures mixed with a plethora of bugs and glitches all showed Illumination for what it really was. A Steam indie game with a AAA name attached to it. So how did Alone in the Dark Illumination end up in such a sorry state? Information on the development, much like the developer, is spotty at best. But we can look at Atari's other major project at the time, Roller Coaster Tycoon World. That game development cycle was troubled, with 3 developers all working on the title during its run. The 2 major devs, Area 52 Games and Envisio Creations, much like pure FPS, were totally unknown to the gaming world. It seems obvious that Atari, following on from their bankruptcy, wanted to watch the pennies when it came to rebooting their franchises. Illumination feels like it was a low-budget game designed to cash in on the goodwill of Alone in the Dark fans, or whatever was left of that goodwill after constant failed reboots. It was a half-baked, half-arsed idea, hoping to copy more popular games in the genre. Also, just to point out, how can you be alone in the dark when you're playing with friends? Even Nightcrawlers needs 2 people. As you might expect, the Steam reviews are absolutely damning for Illumination. Just like that, they killed the last good hope for the Alone in the Dark franchise. Boggles my mind how this got released, and there's also, it's like a Left 4 Dead without fun, good combat and shooting, art design, balance and players. Don't buy it. Alone in the Dark 2008 had left the franchise on life support. Illumination just snuck in and pulled the plug. Alone in the Dark Illumination was simply a bad game, poorly funded and created by inexperienced developers. There was never a chance that this game would turn out to be a success. Alone in the Dark had died unceremoniously, almost in the dark, and it would seemingly never return. However, in gaming, is anything truly forever? Well, certainly not in Alone in the Dark's case, as in 2024, Alone in the Dark is shuffling back onto consoles for the first time in over 15 years, under the guidance of new owner THQ Nordic, who we're still mad at for time splitters by the way, we're still really mad at you, and being developed by Magica 2 developer Pieces Entertainment. This latest Alone in the Dark reboot is being written and developed by Michael Hedberg, who had previously penned horror game classics Soma and Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Previews have been favourable, and a short demo, Grace in the Dark Prologue, showed off the game's design and control mechanics, even if it was a little bit too short. Fans were also encouraged by the reveal that Stranger Things actor David Harbour and Killing Eve's Jodie Comer, and also a long-suffering Evertonian, will be taking on the roles of Ed Carnby and Emily Hartwood, respectively. The survival horror community has their collective fingers and toes crossed that Pieces Entertainment has the ability to pull off an update of that classic game, but when you consider what came before it, they couldn't do much worse. Alongside the Dead Space remake absolute whipper that is Alan Wake 2 and ongoing force that is Resident Evil, we are truly living in a survival horror renaissance. If all goes to plan, Alone in the Dark will join that movement when it is released. Oh, today! And that was our video looking at the recent past of Alone in the Dark, or merely the lack of it. Did you find that illuminating? Will you be picking up Alone in the Dark today? Be sure to let us know down in the comments down below, and thank you for watching.